Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. I'm sure some of you might have known about this, others may have not, but on the 13th and 14th of January of 2024, London Overground services operated between Watford Junction and Stratford via Gospel Oak and West Hampstead on an every 15-minute headway throughout much of those 2 days due to the London Euston to Willesden Junction and Richmond and Clapham Junction to Willesden Junction sections of the North London Line and Watford DC lines being shut. Whilst I don't think we have ever seen a Watford Junction to Stratford service operate via Willesden Junction low level before, we have seen them operate through Primrose Hill when the North London line was seeing upgrades after its takeover by TfL in 2007, where the DC service ran from Watford Junction to Stratford via South Hampstead, before taking the curve through Primrose Hill and Camden Market and meeting the North London line at Camden Road. In this video, I will be discussing when most of this merger was actually a proper service, at least for much of the route, where services didn't always run into London Euston and instead ran into other parts of the city, including the East End. Anyway, all that and more from me in this video. If you guys like this type of content, please like, subscribe and share this video, as it massively helps me out when you do. Now, on with the video. To give you an idea of what the current service level is on the Watford DC line, services currently operate every 15 minutes using 4-carriage Class 710-2s out of London Euston. The Watford DC line currently has stations at South Hampstead, Kilburn High Road, Queen's Park, Kensal Green, Willesden Junction, Harlesden, Stonebridge Park, Wembley Central, North Wembley, South Kenton, Kenton, Harrow and Wealdstone, Headstone Lane, Hatch End, Carpenter's Park, Bushey, Watford High Street and Watford Junction. The Watford DC lines were first opened back in 1912 between Watford Junction and Camden, when the London and North Western Railway wanted to provide additional suburban capacity so that more services could operate into London Euston. It incorporated some of the pre-existing Rickmansworth to Watford Junction line through Watford High Street, with the new self-contained line from Bushey to Queen's Park, and the existing slow lines between Queen's Park and South Hampstead, before following the line into Euston where the current service terminates. The name Watford DC came about due to the line being electrified with direct current with conductor rails to be more compatible with the London Underground's fourth rail system, which then allowed the extension of the Baker Street and Waterloo Railway, now known as the Bakerloo Line, from Paddington through Queen's Park to Watford Junction. The line initially commenced operation with Oelecon, excuse the terrible pronunciation, electric trains under the London and North Western Railway, and had a far higher frequency than what the line currently sees today, even with the Bakerloo line as far as Harrow and Wealdstone. In the 1950s, the London and North Western Railway service operated an intense frequency between Watford and South Hampstead, although some services did terminate at Croxley Green rather than Watford, with 5 trains per hour running into Euston and 7 running via Primrose Hill and Dalston into Broad Street. The operation was so intense that an automated signalling system was installed, although it was replaced in 1988, but by that point services were nowhere near as frequent as they once were. By the time we hit the 1960s, Bakerloo line services running from Stonebridge Park to Watford Junction started to become quite scarce, before all trains were culled north of Stonebridge Park in 1982. However, a service was then reintroduced in 1984 to operate as far as Harrow and Wealdstone, so from 1984 onwards, it was only Watford DC services operating towards Watford Junction and Bushey. When the 501s operated on the Watford DC line from the 1950s onwards, replacing the previous rolling stock, services operating into Broad Street from the North London line came in various different forms, with various stops skipped and different car length formations on each different service. Services with the head code B1 operated into London Euston, calling it all stations, with B2 services calling it all stations excluding Canonbury and Caledonian Road, B3 services calling it all stations via Hampstead Heath excluding Brondesbury Park, Kentish Town West, Caledonian Road and Barmsbury, and Canonbury, B5 operating between Broad Street and Willesden Junction, and B6 from Broad Street to Watford that didn't call at Canonbury, Highbury and Islington, Caledonian Road and Barmsbury, Primrose Hill, South Hampstead, Kilburn High Road, Kensal Green, Harlesden and Stonebridge Park. There was also a B4 that operated a service from Broad Street to Richmond which called at all stations. Broad Street, where part of the Watford DC service terminated up until its closure, was also opened by the London and North Western Railway on the 1st of November 1865. The London and North Western Railway was keen to expand into the city and were keen to establish a goods yard there, so on the 22nd of July 1861, the North London Railway Act allowed a connecting line along the Kingsland Viaduct into Broad Street to be established, with stations at Dalston, Haggerston and Shoreditch established. 7 platforms were initially constructed in the station, however another one was constructed in 1891 and a 9th was constructed in 1913. The station costed £122 million in 2021 value to construct and initially operated services from Broad Street towards Chalk Farm, Bow and Kew via Hampstead Heath from 1866. The station was a huge success when it came to operating short commuter services for punters living in inner London, so much so that at the beginning of the 20th century, 1 train per minute would be leaving Broad Street. Services that ran towards Bow eventually continued on to Poplar, however they used a specially designed curve at Dalston called the Euston Curve, which has now been converted into a garden just outside Dalston Junction station. The Great Northern Railway, which operated services into London King's Cross a few miles away, also used the station as a supplementary terminus for its services towards High Barnet, Edgware and Ali Pally. The LNWR also had services running as far as Tring by this point, alongside their Watford DC services, and on the 1st of February 1910, a service was introduced called the City to City service from London to Wolverhampton via Coventry and Birmingham New Street. Despite the station's popularity at the beginning of the 20th century, so much so that it was the 3rd busiest station, the station lost a lot of its custom by the time it reached the mid-20th century, due to the number of tube lines and trolley buses operating within the area that had now been built, and also the closure of some of the stations on the line. Haggerston and Shoreditch stations on the line into Broad Street shut in the 1940s, where Haggerston was the first victim of the two due to suffering bomb damage in World War II, and Shoreditch was shut due to air raid damage. Like with many other lines across the country, the line from Dalston to Broad Street was under review by Beeching. Not for closure though, but instead being earmarked for a reduction in the number of services, to create some sort of managed decline if you will. The station, which was once booming with suburban services operating into the depths of North and East London, was starting to fall apart, and in 1967, the majority of the Broad Street train shed was removed due to safety reasons. Of the 9 platforms at Broad Street, only 5 of them remained by 1969, and the platforms became increasingly overgrown with vegetation due to the dire state that they were left in as a result of this managed decline. Another one of the 5 remaining platforms was no longer used in passenger service, once the services from Broad Street towards the East Coast Main Line were diverted into Moorgate along the Northern City Line, which left only the Richmond to Broad Street and Peak Hour Watford Junction to Broad Street services. The Richmond to Broad Street services were eventually diverted towards North Woolwich in 1985, which left the only services stopping at Dalston Junction and terminating at Broad Street being the Watford Peak Hour services. These didn't last too long, and they were confined to 1 terminating platform in Broad Street until the 27th of June 1986, when the final service operated from there. The station was subsequently demolished on the 30th of June 1986, and has now been redeveloped into the Broadgate shopping complex situated in Liverpool Street Station, and also features some office blocks as well. Much of the Dalston to Shoreditch railway alignment was overgrown until its reprieve when the East London line was extended from Shoreditch up to Dalston Junction, with stations reopening at the previously bombed Shoreditch and Haggerston, and a new station opening at Hoxton, as well as the reopening of the old Dalston Junction station. Hoxton is now where the North London Railway Memorial that once stood at Broad Street was moved to in 2011, after having a spell at Richmond. The old railway alignment into Broad Street is still visible, however, as over Great Eastern Street you can see the old Jubilee Line trains that were converted into art studios, and small remnants of the bridge that used to carry trains into Broad Street. For any of you eagle-eyed rail historians, I'm sure you'll notice the old railway viaduct on Fairchild Place, with local businesses located inside the arches now. It's very unlikely that this railway alignment could ever be reopened due to the development that is taking place at the end of Fairchild Place, where the line would start to reach Broad Street, although I'm sure it will never be needed again. The rolling stock operating on the line by this point were Class 313s, that were deemed surplus on the lines towards Welwyn Garden City and round the Hertford Loop, due to too many units being ordered, which then replaced the Class 501s in May 1985 on the service from Broad Street to Watford. Once Broad Street had shut, all the remaining peak time Watford DC services were diverted into Liverpool Street via the newly constructed Graham Road curve just before Hackney Central, where services would call at London Fields, Cambridge Heath and Bethnal Green, before terminating at London Liverpool Street. This continued until September of 1992, when all services that ran into London Liverpool Street from the North London line were discontinued. This was also around the time when Primrose Hill Station had finally closed, a station which was just located around the corner from the Chalk Farm Northern Line station, and the station closed earlier than expected due to flooding inside the station, so closed before the final Watford Junction to London Liverpool Street service. Not too much of Primrose Hill Station remains nowadays, other than the station building which has now been converted into local businesses. The Graham Road curve hasn't found much use other than being used for empty coaching stock movements, although it could always see use as a diversionary curve into London Liverpool Street if necessary. I'm honestly not too sure. By this point, the Watford DC Line was operated by Network South East exclusively to and from London Euston using Class 313s, operating on an every 20-minute headway, before the era of public ownership ended, and in 1997 the service was taken over by Silverlink. Up until the takeover, Network South East had nicknamed the line the Harlequin Line, which was conjured up by mixing together the names of Harlesden and Queen's Park stations. Silverlink weren't known for their best operation of railway services at the time, particularly their metro services, where only 55% of their passengers in 2000 to 2001 were satisfied with the service that they were offered. However, it is worth mentioning the context of the time, where we had seen Railtrack and their numerous maintenance failures on main lines, which included the tragic Ladbroke Grove rail crash in 1999 and the 2 rail crashes on the ECML at Potters Bar and Hatfield at the turn of the millennium, and as a result, line speeds were reduced on the West Coast main line out of fear that another tragedy may occur. Passengers were also left feeling unsafe at stations dotted along the line due to Silverlink's failure to properly staff stations, which led to the tragic death of a lawyer at Kensal Green Station in 2006, and the Mayor of London at the time, Ken Livingstone, spoke openly about how he would not accept a bid to operate services along the Watford DC Line without adequate staffing during the night. Silverlink acquired 3 508-0s from Merseyrail, which were later converted to 508-3s, to displace the Class 313s to other parts of the Silverlink network, and were kept in service until 2010, when London Overground replaced them and the 313s operating on the North London line, with brand new 3-carriage Class 378-0 Capital Stars built by Bombardier in 2008. Whilst the Class 313s operating with Silverlink did see a reprieve in the form of transferring to the south coast to operate with Southern, the Class 508-3s were sent to Eastleigh and scrapped. The 378s over the years, I'm sure you may have noticed, have seen an increase in the number of carriages per unit, where all trains have become 4 carriages in 2011, and all units became 5 carriages long from 2015 onwards, which honestly pays testament to what an integrated ticketing system, a proper brand for the service, and safe station environments can do to attract people to use a service. The Watford DC Line now operates with Class 710s, which were built by Bombardier and at present shares its dual voltage -2 unit with the Gospel Oak to Barking Line. As a result, the Watford DC Line has seen a downgrade from 5 carriages per unit to 4, however the service now operates every 15 minutes, so that does mean there is 1 extra carriage in the peaks than there was before. Now, you might be wondering, well, what was the merged Stratford to Watford Junction service like to travel on when it was operated over that weekend? Well, it was certainly an interesting experience, as it involved us using a rare stretch of track from Kensal Rise down to the low-level platforms in Willesden Junction, which hasn't been something that has happened in public service since the Goblin peak time extra continued through to Willesden Junction until 2018 or so. The service wasn't a success in my opinion, as at least on the Sunday, there were severe delays on the line which led to, at least when I was in Watford at around 1 PM, there being no services coming into Watford Junction, and all of them were east of Willesden Junction, and all that there was there in the DC Line platforms was stabled Class 710s, and in the event of disruption, in my opinion, it would be better if the Willesden to Stratford and Willesden to Watford service were to be kept separate. Now, do I think there will be any chance of these services ever coming back that were mentioned in this video? Honestly, no. I cannot see any Watford to Liverpool Street services ever making a comeback, as there are no available paths both leaving Liverpool Street and on the at-capacity North London line between Hackney Central and Camden Road, and so I should imagine if any capacity were to be freed up, it would be delegated to existing services to bolster their respective frequencies, rather than trying to introduce entirely new services. Plus, these services were of an era. Watford Junction to Liverpool Street can now be done on one form of payment method, being Oyster or contactless, and a London North Western service into London Euston and then the Tube is far quicker than sitting on a stopping Watford DC service that trundles through suburban North West London and along the slow North London line. Previously, you would have had to have bought two separate tickets, and it would make travelling a bit more complex, whereas now due to an integrated ticketing system in the form of the Oyster card and also contactless, it is so much easier to make journeys like this. There's also nowhere to expand Liverpool Street, given the old Broad Street site is now the Broadgate complex and some of the Elizabeth line station at Liverpool Street. Like with many decisions made during this era, it was very short-sighted to have shut Broad Street, as whilst it was very limited in terms of what it could have done in its format at the time, it could have been improved. However, I imagine if the situation did improve, the North London line and East London line would be looking very different nowadays. Anyway, thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe and share this video, as this massively helps me out when you do. And tell me, did you happen to be using this Stratford to Watford service, or did you perhaps use the Liverpool Street or Broad Street to Watford Junction service many moons ago? I always take great interest in what you all comment, so I'll make sure to respond to whatever it is you have to say. Anyway, that's it from me folks, sorry for the very late upload again, take care of yourselves, and see you all in the next video.